reading What is Cinema, Volume 2 by Andre Bazin, The Western or the American Film par excellence. The Western is the only genre whose origins are almost identical with those of the cinema itself, and which is as alive as ever after almost half a century of uninterrupted success. Even if one disputes the quality of its inspiration and of its style since the 30s, one is amazed at the steady commercial success which is the measure of its health. Doubtless the Western has not entirely escaped the evolution of cinema taste, or indeed taste, period. It has been and will again be subjected to influences from the outside. For instance, the crime novel, the detective story, or the social problems of the day, and its simplicity and strict form have suffered as a result. We may be entitled to regret this, but not to see in it a state of decay. These influences are only felt in a few productions of relatively high standing and do not affect the low-budget films aimed principally at the home market. Furthermore, it is as important for us to marvel at the Western's capacity to resist them as to deplore these passing moments of contamination. Every influence acts on them like a vaccine. The microbe, on contact, loses its deadly virulence. In the course of 15 years, the American comedy has exhausted its resources. If it survives in the occasional success, if it survives in an occasional success, it is only to the extent that, in some way, it abandons the rules that, before the war, made for successful comedy. From Underworld, 1927, to Scarface, 1932, the gangster film had already completed the cycle of its growth. The scenarios of detective stories have developed rapidly, and if it is still possible to rediscover an aesthetic of violence within the framework of the criminal adventure which they share with Scarface, we would be hard put to see in the private eye, the journalist, or the G-man the reflection of the original hero. Furthermore, if there is such a genre as the American detective film, one cannot attribute to it the independent identity of the Western. The literature which preceded it has continued to influence it, and the latest interesting variants of the crime film derived directly from it. On the contrary, the durability of the Western heroes and plots has been demonstrated recently by the fabulous success on television of the old Hopalong Cassidy films. The Western does not age. Its worldwide appeal is even more astonishing than its historical survival. What can there possibly be to interest Arabs, Hindus, Latins, Germans, or Anglo-Saxons, among whom the Western has had an uninterrupted success? about evocations of the birth of the United States of America, the struggle between Buffalo Bill and the Indians, the laying down of the railroad, or the Civil War! Exclamation point. The Western must possess some greater secret than simply the secret of youthfulness. It must be a secret that somehow identifies with the essence of cinema. It is easy to say that because the cinema is movement, the Western is cinema par excellence. It is true that galloping horses and fights are its usual ingredients. But in that case, the Western would simply be one variety of adventure story. Again, the continuous movement of the characters, carried almost to a pitch of frenzy, is inseparable from its geographical setting, and one might just as well define the Western by its set, the frontier town, and its landscapes. But other genres and schools of filmmaking have made use of the dramatic poetry of the landscape. For example, the silent Swedish film, but although it contributes to their greatness, it did not ensure their survival. Better still, sometimes, as in The Overlanders, a Western theme is borrowed, in this case the traditional cattle drive, and set in a landscape, Central Australia, reasonably like the American West. The result, as we know, was excellent. But fortunately, no attempt was made to follow up this paradoxical achievement, whose success was due to an unusual combination of circumstances. If in fact, Westerns have been shot in France against the landscapes of the Camargue, one can only see in this an additional proof of the popularity and healthiness of a genre that can survive counterfeiting, pastiche, or even parody. It would be hopeless to try to reduce the essence of the Western to one or other of these manifest components. The same ingredients are to be found elsewhere, but not the same benefits that appear to go with them. Therefore, the Western must be something else again than its form: galloping horses, fights, strong and brave men in a wildly austere landscape could not add up to a definition of the genre, nor encompass its charms. Those formal attributes by which one normally recognizes the Western are simply signs or symbols of its profound reality, namely, the myth. The Western was born of an encounter between a mythology and a means of expression. The saga of the West existed before the cinema in literary and folklore form, and the multiplication of Western films has not killed off Western literature, which still retains its public and continues to provide screenwriters with their best material. But there is no common measure between the limited and national audience for the Western stories and the worldwide audience for the films which they inspire. Just as the miniatures of the books of hours served as models for the statuary and the stained glass windows of the cathedrals, this Western literature, freed from the bonds of language, finds a distribution on the screen in keeping with its size, almost as if the dimensions of the image had become one with those of the imagination. This book, J.L. Peyrout's La Grande Adventure du Western, 1894 through 1964, for which Bazin was here writing the preface, will emphasize a little-known aspect of the Western, its faithfulness to history. This is not generally recognized, primarily, doubtless, because of our ignorance, but still more because of the deeply rooted prejudice according to which the Western can only tell extremely puerile stories, fruits of a naive power of invention that does not concern itself with psychological, historical, or even material verisimilitude. True, few Westerns are explicitly concerned with historical accuracy. True, too, these are not the only ones of any value. It would be absurd to judge the characters of Tom Mix, still more of his magic white horse, or even of William Hart or Douglas Fairbanks, all of whom made lovely films in the great primitive period of the Western, by the yardstick of archaeology. After all, many current Westerns of honorable standing, I am thinking of Beyond the Great Divide, Yellow Sky, or High Noon, have only a tenuous relationship to historical fact. They are primarily works of imagination, but one would be as much in error not to recognize the historical references in the Western as to deny the unabashed freedom of its screenplays. J.L. Peyrout gives a complete account of the birth of its epic-like idealization, based on comparatively recent history, yet it could be that his study, concerned to recall to us what is ordinarily forgotten or even not known, and confining itself to films that justify his thesis, discards by implication the other side of the aesthetic reality. Still, this would show him to be doubly right, for the relations between the facts of history and the Western are not immediate and direct, but dialectic. Tom Mix is the opposite of Abraham Lincoln, but after his own fashion, he perpetuates Lincoln's cult and his memory. In its most romantic or most naive form, the Western is the opposite of a historical reconstruction. There is no difference between Hopalong Cassidy and Tarzan except for their costume in the arena in which they demonstrate their prowess. However, if one wanted to take the trouble to compare these delightful but unlikely stories and to superimpose on them, as is done in modern physiognomy, a number of negatives of faces, an ideal Western would come through, composed of all the constants common to one and to the other, a Western made up solely of unalloyed myth. Let us take one example, that of the woman. In the first third of the film, the good cowboy meets the pure young woman, the good and strong virgin, let us call her, with whom he falls in love. Despite its chasteness, we are able to guess this love is shared. However, virtually insurmountable obstacles stand in its way. One of the most significant and most frequent comes from the family of the beloved or of the beloved. For example, her brother is a sinister scoundrel, and the good cowboy is forced to rid society of him, man to man. A modern Jazmine R heroine refuses to see her brother's assassin any sort of a fine fellow. In order to redeem himself in his charmer's eyes and merit forgiveness, our knight must now pass through a series of fabulous trials. He ends by saving his elected bride from a danger that could be fatal to her person, her virtue, her fortune, or all three at once. Following which, since we are now near the end of the film, the damsel would indeed be ungrateful if she did not feel that her suitor had repaid his debt and allowed him to start dreaming of lots of children. Up to this point, this outline into which one can weave 1,000 variants, for example, by substituting the Civil War for the Indian threat, cattle rustlers, comes close to reminding us of the medieval courtly romances by virtue of the preeminence given to the woman and the trials that the finest of heroes must undergo in order to qualify for her love. But the story is often complicated by a paradoxical character, the saloon B-girl, who as a rule is also in love with the cowboy. So there would be one woman too many if the god of the screenwriter was not keeping watch. A few minutes before the end, the prostitute with the heart of gold rescues the man she loves from some danger or another, sacrificing her life and her hopeless love for the happiness of her cowboy. This also serves to redeem her in the eyes of the spectators. There is food for thought here. Note, first of all, that the distinction between good and bad applies only to the men. Women, all up and down the social scale, are in every case worthy of love, or at least of esteem or pity. The least little prostitute is redeemed by love and death, although she is spared the latter in Stagecoach, with its resemblance to De Maupassant's Bol de Suits. It is true that the good cowboy is more or less a reformed offender, so that henceforth the most moral of marriages with his heroine becomes possible. Furthermore, in the world of the Western, it is the women who are good and the men who are bad, so bad that the best of them must redeem themselves from the original sin of their sex by undergoing various trials. In the Garden of Eden, Eve led Adam into temptation. Paradoxically, Anglo-Saxon Puritanism, under the pressure of historical circumstances, reverses the biblical situation. The downfall of the woman only comes about as a result of the concupiscence of men. Clearly, this theory derives from the actual sociological conditions obtaining in primitive Western society, which, because of the scarcity of women and the perils of a too harsh existence in this burgeoning world, make it imperative to safeguard its female members and its horses. Hanging was considered enough punishment for stealing a horse. To engender respect for women, more was needed than the fear of a risk as trifling as the loss of one's life, namely the positive power of a myth. The myth of the Western illustrates and both initiates and confirms woman in her role as vestal of the social virtues, of which this chaotic world is so greatly in need. Within her is concealed the physical future, and by way of the institution of the family to which she aspires, as the root is drawn to the earth, its moral foundation. These myths, of which we have just examined what is perhaps the most significant example, the next myth is the myth of the horse, may themselves doubtless be reduced to an even more essential principle. Basically, each of these particularized by way of an already specific dramatic plot. The great epic Manichaeism, which sets the forces of evil over against the knights of the true cause. These immense stretches of prairie, of deserts, of rocks to which the little wooden town clings precariously, a primitive amoeba of a civilization, are exposed to all manner of possible things. The Indian, who lived in this world, was incapable of imposing on it man's order. He mastered it only by identifying himself with its pagan savagery. The white Christian, on the contrary, is truly the conqueror of a new world. The grass sprouts where his horse has passed. He imposes simultaneously his moral and his technical order, the one link to the other, in the former guaranteeing the latter. The physical safety of the stagecoaches, the protection given by the federal troops, the building of the great railroads are less important perhaps than the establishment of justice and respect for the law. The relations between morality and law, which in our ancient civilization are just a subject for an undergraduate paper, were half a century ago the most vital thing confronting the youthful United States. Everyone knows that familiarity with death does not keep alive the fear of hell, nor do scruples or moral debate. Policemen and judges are of most help to the weak. It was the force of this conquering humanity that constituted its weakness. Where individual morality is precarious, it is only law that can impose the order of the good and the good of order. But the law is unjust to the extent that it pretends to guarantee a moral society but ignores the individual merits of those who constitute that society. If it is to be effective, this justice must be dispensed by men who are just as strong and just as daring as the criminals. These virtues, as we have said, are in no way compatible with virtue in the absolute sense. The sheriff is not always a better person than the man he hangs. This begets and establishes an inevitable and necessary contradiction. There is often little moral difference between the outlaw in the man who operates within the law. Still, the sheriff's star must be seen as constituting a sacrament of justice, whose worth does not depend on the worthiness of the man who administers it. To this first contradiction, a second must be added: the administration of justice, which, if it is to be effective, must be drastic and speedy. Short of lynching, however, and thus must ignore extenuating circumstances, such as alibis that would take too long to verify. In protecting society, such a form of justice runs the risk of unkindness to the most turbulent, though not perhaps the least useful, nor even the least deserving of its children. Although the need for law was never more clearly allied to the need for morality, at the same time, never was their antagonism more concrete and more evident. It is this which provides a basis within a slapstick framework for Charles Pilgrim, at the conclusion of which we see our hero riding his horse along the borderline between good and evil, which also happens to be the Mexican border. John Ford's Stagecoach, which is a fine dramatic illustration of the parable of the Pharisee and the publican, demonstrates that a prostitute can be more respectable than the narrow-minded people who drove her out of town, and just as respectable as an officer's wife. That a dissolute gambler knows how to die with all the dignity of an aristocrat. That an alcoholic doctor can practice his profession with competence and devotion. That an outlaw who is being sought for the payment of past and possibly future debts can show loyalty, generosity, courage, and refinement, whereas a banker of considerable standing and reputation runs off with the cash box. So we find at the source of the Western the ethics of the epic and even of tragedy. The Western is in the epic category because of the superhuman level of its heroes and the legendary magnitude of their feast of valor. Billy the Kid is as invulnerable as Achilles, and his revolver is infallible. The cowboy is a knight at arms. The style of the mise en scène is in keeping with the character of the hero. A transformation into an epic is evident in the setups of the shots, with their predilection for vast horizons, all-encompassing shots that constantly bring to mind the conflict between man and nature. The Western has virtually no use for the close-up, even for the medium shot, preferring by contrast the traveling shot and the pan, which refuse to be limited by the frame line and which restore to space its fullness. True enough, but this epic style derives its real meaning only from the morality which underlies and justifies it. It is the morality of a world in which social good and evil, in their simplicity and necessity, exist like two primary and basic elements. But good in its natural but good in its natal state engenders law in all its primitive rigor. Epic becomes tragedy. On the appearance of the first conflict between the transcendence of social justice and the individual character of moral justice, between the categorical imperative of the law, which guarantees the order of the future city, and the no less unshakable order of the individual conscious. The Cornell-like simplicity of Western scripts has often been a subject for parody. It is easy to see the analogy between them in the text of Cid. There is the same conflict between love and duty, the same nightly ordeals on the completion of which the wise virgin will consent to forget the insult to her family, the same chaste sentiments which are based on a concept of love subordinated to respect for the laws of society and morality. But this comparison is double-edged. To make fun of the Western by comparing it to Cornell is also to draw attention to its greatness, a greatness near perhaps the childlike, just as childhood is near to poetry. Let there be no doubt about it. This naive greatness is recognized in Westerns by simple men in every clime. Together with the children, despite differences of language, landscape, customs, and dress, the epic and the tragic hero is a universal character. The Civil War is part of the 19th century history. The Western has turned it into the Trojan War of the most modern epics. The migration to the West is our Odyssey. Not only is the historicity of the Western not at odds with no less evident penchant of the genre for outlandish situations, exaggerations of fact, and the use of the deus ex machina, in short, everything that makes for improbability. It is, on the contrary, the foundation of its aesthetic and its psychology. The history of film has only known one other epic cinema, and that too is a historical cinema. Our purpose here is not to compare epic form in the Russian and in the American film, and yet an analysis of their styles would shed an unexpected light on the historical meaning of the events reconstructed in the two of them. Our only purpose is to point out that it is not their closeness to the facts that has given them their styles. There are legends that come into being almost instantaneously, that half a generation suffices to ripen into an epic. Like the conquest of the West, the Soviet Revolution is a collection of historical events which signal the birth of a new order and a new civilization. Both have begotten the myths necessary for the confirmation of history. Both had to reinvent a morality to rediscover at their living source and before mixture or pollution took place. The foundation of the law which would make out, or which would make order out of chaos, separate heaven from earth. But perhaps the cinema was the only language capable of expressing this, above all, of giving it its true aesthetic dimension. Without the cinema, the conquest of the West would have left behind, in the shape of the Western story, only a minor literature, and it is neither by its painting nor its novels that Soviet art has given the world a picture of its grandeur. The fact is that henceforth the cinema is the specifically epic art. And I was reading the Western, or the American film par excellence, in What is Cinema, Volume 2 by Andre Bazin,